The topic of this video is Abraham Lincoln's greatest struggles, the battles that tested a president. Welcome to History Unlocked, where we uncover the profound trials that defined history's most tested leaders. If you value understanding the true weight of command during America's most perilous hour, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss the moments that shaped our world. When Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency, the republic he had sworn to preserve was already tearing itself apart, and the struggles that would test him reached far beyond any battlefield into the deepest chambers of his resolve, his judgment, and his capacity to endure burdens that would have crushed lesser souls. The first battle began before he even entered office, as credible threats against his life forced him to alter his route to Washington and arrive under cover of darkness. A humiliating beginning that enemies mocked as cowardice but which revealed the deadly hatred already directed toward a man who had not yet wielded a single day of presidential power. He took office facing a nation already fragmenting, with states having declared independence and seized federal installations, arsenals, and military posts, while his own cabinet contained men who regarded him as a backwoods lawyer wholly inadequate to the catastrophe unfolding before them. Men who had competed against him for the nomination and who viewed his elevation as a political accident rather than a vindication of merit. His opening struggle centered on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where he faced an impossible choice between resupplying the besieged garrison and almost certainly triggering war or abandoning it and surrendering federal authority over sovereign territory. A decision that left him sleepless night after night as he weighed constitutional principles against the thousands of lives that would be lost in the conflict he knew was coming. When Confederate artillery opened fire on the fort in the early morning hours, his worst fears materialized into the thunder of guns and the reality of rebellion, and he confronted the immediate challenge of raising an army from a nation possessing virtually no standing military force capable of suppressing a full-scale insurrection across multiple states, requiring him to issue calls for volunteers and navigate the treacherous politics of border states whose allegiance remained uncertain and whose choice would determine whether the task ahead was difficult or utterly impossible. The border state struggle consumed enormous energy and demanded constant attention as he recognized with painful clarity that losing Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, or Delaware to the Confederacy would make Union victory nearly impossible by surrounding the capital, cutting supply lines, and providing the rebellion with resources and manpower that would tip the balance irreversibly. Yet holding their loyalty demanded restraint on the question of emancipation that conflicted with his deepest moral convictions and the expectations of the anti-slavery Republicans who had elevated him to office. His relationship with military commanders became a source of profound and lasting frustration as he cycled through generals who proved either too cautious to seize opportunities or too reckless to preserve their forces. Beginning with the elderly and infirm Winfield Scott, who possessed wisdom but lacked the physical capacity for active command, and continuing through George McClellan, who possessed genuine organizational brilliance and the devoted loyalty of his troops but demonstrated persistent and maddening reluctance to engage the enemy despite commanding forces superior in numbers, training, and equipment. The struggle with McClellan proved especially bitter and personally wounding as the young general treated Lincoln with barely concealed contempt, constantly demanding additional reinforcements and postponing offensive operations with elaborate excuses, while Confederate armies under more aggressive leadership achieved dramatic victories that demoralized Northern citizens, emboldened Southern resolve, and strengthened the voices of those calling for negotiated peace that would preserve slavery and accept the permanent division of the nation. Lincoln endured the agony of watching his armies suffer devastating defeats at Bull Run, where panicked troops fled back to Washington in chaos, at Fredericksburg, where Union soldiers were slaughtered in futile frontal assaults against prepared positions, and at Chancellorsville, where superior Confederate generalship turned what should have been Union victory into humiliating retreat. Battles that filled Northern hospitals with wounded and dying men and filled Northern homes with grief and anger while he bore ultimate responsibility for continuing a war that many increasingly viewed as unwinnable and not worth the staggering cost in blood, treasure, and suffering. The personal torment of visiting military hospitals where young soldiers, some barely more than boys, lay dying from terrible wounds or wasting diseases, of writing careful letters of condolence to bereaved mothers and widows who had sacrificed everything for a cause that seemed to bring only more loss, of carrying the weight of every single casualty upon his own conscience as though he had personally struck the blow that killed them, carved deep lines into his face and added years to his appearance that photographs documented with merciless and unflinching clarity. His struggle over the question of emancipation involved balancing unshakable moral conviction that slavery was a profound evil against hard political reality and military necessity, knowing that premature action might drive wavering border states into open rebellion and cost him the war, while continued delay contradicted the very principles of human equality and natural rights that he believed the war must ultimately serve if the sacrifices were to have lasting meaning beyond mere preservation of governmental structure. When he finally issued the Emancipation Proclamation following the costly and ambiguous victory at Antietam, a battle that ended Lee's first invasion of the North but failed to destroy his army, he faced fierce and organized resistance from Northern Democrats who accused him of unconstitutionally transforming a war for Union restoration into an abolitionist crusade for racial equality, from soldiers who threatened desertion rather than fight for black freedom, and from foreign governments, particularly Britain and France, who questioned whether he possessed legal authority for such a revolutionary act and who watched carefully for any excuse to recognize Confederate independence and intervene on behalf of Southern cotton. The political battle of maintaining public support for continuing the war effort required him to take controversial actions, including suspending the constitutional guarantee of habeas corpus and authorizing military arrests of Confederate sympathizers, newspaper editors who published defeatist or seditious material, and political agitators who actively discouraged enlistment. Actions that provoked loud accusations of tyranny and dictatorship and raised genuine and troubling questions about whether preserving the Union justified such stark departures from constitutional norms that defined the very freedom the war was supposedly defending. He struggled simultaneously against Copperhead Democrats who agitated for immediate peace negotiations that would accept Confederate independence and restore the old Union with slavery intact, against radical Republicans who demanded more aggressive prosecution of the war, faster movement toward complete emancipation, and harsh treatment of conquered Southern territory, and against moderates within his own party who questioned whether he possessed the political skill and judgment to navigate successfully between these extremes while maintaining the delicate coalition necessary for victory. The military struggle reached its lowest and most desperate point in the summer following the victory at Gettysburg, when despite that great battle and the simultaneous fall of Vicksburg which gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, the war ground on with no end visible on any horizon. Casualties mounted beyond anything Americans had previously imagined possible in their worst nightmares, and Lincoln faced the very real possibility of losing the presidential election to Democrat George McClellan, his former general, who would negotiate peace and abandon emancipation, a prospect that would render meaningless and worthless every sacrifice the war had demanded and every drop of blood that had been shed. His long search for a general willing to fight with the relentless determination and acceptance of casualties necessary to break Confederate resistance finally ended when he elevated Ulysses Grant to supreme command, a man whose willingness to accept heavy losses in pursuit of clear strategic objectives shocked and horrified many observers but who understood with brutal clarity that the Confederacy's capacity to replace casualties was finite and that Union numerical and industrial superiority must eventually prevail if applied with sufficient persistence and willingness to pay the price. The terrible overland campaigns through the wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor tested Lincoln's nerve and resolve as Grant's armies suffered casualties that exceeded even McClellan's worst losses during the Peninsula Campaign, and mounting public horror at the seemingly endless carnage strengthened peace sentiment and defeatism that threatened to deliver victory to McClellan in the election and undo everything the war had accomplished at such staggering cost. Lincoln's personal struggles extended beyond public affairs into private sorrows that would have broken many men, including a marriage increasingly strained by his wife Mary's emotional instability, excessive spending that created public scandal, and erratic behavior that embarrassed him, the devastating death of his beloved son Willie from typhoid fever that plunged him into grief so profound and consuming that he could barely function for weeks and never fully recovered, and the constant barrage of newspaper attacks that portrayed him simultaneously as tyrant and weakling, buffoon and despot, attacking his appearance, his intellect, his policies, his character, and his fitness for office with a viciousness and cruelty that would have destroyed a less resilient spirit. He battled throughout his presidency against his own deep melancholy, what he called his hypo, a darkness and depression that periodically descended upon him like a suffocating weight in which the war's endless burdens and sorrows only deepened and intensified, yet which he managed to control and transcend through deliberate humor and storytelling, through complete immersion in work that left no time for brooding. and through fundamental commitment to a cause larger than himself that transcended personal suffering and gave meaning to his pain. The constitutional struggle of determining exactly what powers the presidency possessed during armed rebellion, whether the seceded states had actually left the Union or had merely rebelled while remaining within it, and how Reconstruction should proceed if Union victory were achieved, required him to develop constitutional theories and legal frameworks that had no clear precedent in American history and that would profoundly shape executive authority and federal power far beyond his own lifetime. His diplomatic struggle to prevent European recognition of the Confederacy and foreign intervention in the war, particularly by Britain and France, whose industrial economies depended heavily on Southern cotton and whose governments viewed potential American division with barely concealed satisfaction, demanded sophisticated diplomatic skill and strategic thinking that his inexperienced administration initially lacked but gradually developed through painful trial and costly error. The financial challenge of funding an enormous and expanding military effort involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers while maintaining public credit and preventing complete collapse of the currency system required innovative and unprecedented measures, including implementation of the first federal income tax, issuance of paper money backed only by government promise rather than gold or silver, and creation of a national banking system. Measures that sparked fierce debate about the proper limits of federal power and established precedents that permanently transformed American economic policy. He struggled knowing that his decisions would determine not merely whether the Union survived as a political entity but what kind of nation it would become, whether slavery would be completely eradicated or would survive in modified forms, whether Black Americans would gain genuine citizenship with meaningful rights or would remain in permanent legally enforced subordination. Questions whose answers would shape American society, politics, and race relations for generations and perhaps centuries to come. The nature of his struggle shifted as military victory became increasingly certain and he confronted entirely new questions about how to bring Confederate states back into proper constitutional relationship with the Union, whether to pursue policies of harsh punishment and extended military occupation or generous reconciliation and rapid restoration. How to balance demands for justice and protection for formerly enslaved people against political realities and the practical difficulties of reforming an entire society. His second inaugural address, delivered as the war entered its final phase, captured his profound spiritual struggle to comprehend the war's larger meaning and divine purpose, suggesting that perhaps God had imposed this terrible conflict upon both North and South as just punishment for the national sin of slavery, that perhaps the war would continue until every drop of blood drawn by the overseer's lash had been repaid by blood drawn by the soldier's sword, a theological interpretation that transcended simple narratives of Northern righteousness and Southern villainy and acknowledged shared guilt requiring shared suffering. The final struggle came in the war's last days as he wrestled with the immense practical challenges of Reconstruction, met with Confederate leaders to discuss possible peace terms, visited the captured Confederate capital of Richmond and walked streets that days before had been enemy territory, and contemplated how to transform hard-won military victory into lasting political settlement that would secure both union and freedom while healing wounds that had torn the nation apart. His life ended violently before he could fully implement or even completely articulate his vision of Reconstruction conducted with malice toward none and charity for all, before he could determine whether the struggles that had tested him so severely during war had adequately prepared him for the different but equally difficult struggles of binding up the nation's wounds and achieving a just and lasting peace. The battles that tested Abraham Lincoln as president were not only the military engagements where armies clashed and men died in vast numbers, but also the political struggles against determined enemies within his own governing coalition, the constitutional struggles with unprecedented questions that had no clear answers in law or precedent, the moral struggles between pragmatic necessity and absolute principle, and the intensely personal struggles against overwhelming grief, debilitating depression, withering criticism, and the crushing psychological weight of responsibility for hundreds of thousands of deaths. He was tested severely by external enemies who sought to destroy the Union he had sworn to preserve, by political allies and supporters who doubted his capacity to save it and questioned his every decision, by the severe limitations of his own knowledge and experience when confronting challenges no previous president had faced, by the sheer magnitude of a crisis that no amount of skill or wisdom could quickly resolve, and by his own demanding conscience that insisted he remain true to fundamental principles even when immediate circumstances strongly tempted him to abandon or compromise them for short-term advantage. The man who emerged from these prolonged and terrible struggles was visibly transformed by them, aged far beyond his actual years, physically worn and spiritually marked by sorrows that no military triumph or political success could ever erase. yet somehow possessing a hard-won moral clarity and depth of purpose that elevated his leadership beyond mere political skill or tactical cleverness into something approaching genuine wisdom. His greatest struggle was perhaps the fundamental struggle to maintain hope and faith when all reason and evidence suggested despair, to persist in the face of defeats and setbacks when others counseled surrender or compromise, to continue believing that the war's terrible cost in lives and suffering would ultimately serve noble purposes truly worthy of the immense sacrifice, and to trust that a nation originally conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could not only endure its greatest test but could perhaps even be reborn and purified through the very crisis that threatened to destroy it forever. Subscribe to our channel History Unlocked and press the bell icon so that every upcoming historical story reaches our viewers on time.